Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Vice Foreign Minister Xie Feng met U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman in Tianjin on July the 27th as the next round of Sino-U.S. talks after the Anchorage meeting earlier this year. Wang Yi says dialogue will help chart a path for the two countries' peaceful coexistence, and their win-win interactions will benefit the world as well. The top Chinese diplomat urged the U.S. to break away from pride and prejudice, stop lecturing, and return to a reasonable China policy. For his part, Xie Feng said that demonizing China as an imagined enemy will do little to ease dissatisfaction in the U.S.
目前呢，中美关系陷入了僵局。
The fundamental reason for the current relations between China and the United States have been a stalemate is that some in the United States regard China as an imagined enemy, an attempt to deflate the U.S. domestic political and economic dissatisfaction by demonizing China. They will not succeed in such goals by blaming China for the United States' deep structural problems. The U.S. crackdown on China will neither defeat China nor save the U.S. itself. The world today calls for solidarity and cooperation. The United States should choose to show mutual respect with China with fair competition and peaceful diplomacy.
So what's next between China and U.S.? With us in the program, via Skype in New York, Daniel Russell, the Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute Asia, and also in Beijing, Yuan Peng, the President of the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, on the phone with me. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. First question, how would you assess the result of the talk? Professor Yuan Peng.
Oh, yes, I think the results is this meeting is very necessary and also helpful for stabilize the relations. As the Deputy Foreign Minister Xie Feng mentioned after this summit, he gave a very objective assessment because we don't have any illusion for this meeting, and we had very realistic expectations. So comparison with the Alaska meeting between the top diplomat officials, this meeting I think is more realistic, and everything is just in our expectation. For example, for Chinese sides, we are very clearly presented our basic stance and provided the reaffirmed Chinese three bottom lines presented by State Councilor Wang Yi and the two lists presented by Deputy Foreign Minister Xie Feng. I think is very clear message to the United States.
All right, Mr. Russell.
Hey, well, thank you, Chen Wei. Look, it's really critical that the two sides have reliable channels of communication. I totally agree with Yuan Peng on that. And this is only the second official bilateral diplomatic discussion in the 6 months of the Biden administration. My own experience is, look, diplomacy is not an argument. It's not a debate. Real diplomacy is about persuasion, not about winning an argument. And when diplomats sit down together at the table, they really need to be talking to each other, not giving a theatrical performance to show the folks back home that they're, enthusiastic wolf warriors. So look, it's a complex relationship, no question about it. Dialogue is necessary. Meetings alone aren't sufficient, but it's not enough to lay down on the table your list of complaints. And it's also, I think, very troubling, Tianwei, to hear the Chinese side say that China isn't going to cooperate on global issues like climate change or non-proliferation unless the U.S. changes its policies that China doesn't like. That's a conditional approach, a transactional approach to global issues that's not helpful, I think.
Professor Yuan, of course, I need to let you respond.
I partially agreed or partially disagreed to Daniel Russell's statement, because we didn't complain. We just very clearly presented our stance, our lists, our bottom lines. If this sounds a little bit assertive from American perspective, but if you look through for the details of the lists and the bottom lines, it's very basic. For example, from State Councilor Wang Yi's Chinese bottom lines, just mentioned Americans should respect Chinese path and the social system of Chinese characteristic of socialism and the development rights and the sovereignty. This is very basic requirements. As for the lists presented by Xie the two lists, one is a wrongdoings list, one is a key individual cases list, and all those wrongdoing lists without delete. How can we expect U.S.-China relations move ahead? We didn't blame on Joe Biden for everything wrong. We just blame on Donald Trump for many bad wrongdoings. But we need, as a new administration, if we want to improve the relations, you should do something positively rather than do nothing, and rather than just using those wrongdoing things being a leverage to be more harmful on China. This is more dangerous. So we just want to very clearly present our stance so that the relations can be moving ahead. Otherwise, it's a misperception even deeper. This is not constructive.
It seems that both sides have been trying since the Biden administration coming into the office to lay the groundwork, or shall we say even more exactly, the guardrail about what is likely to be the framework of a relationship between the two countries. Of course, a lot of things are still in the process, and both sides are testing one another from a journalistic perspective, if I could, from a third party observation. So now there are several questions that are immediate. It seems that both sides need to understand and also show their attitude. First of all, whether there's going to be a head of state interaction directly, for example, at the G20 later in October, that is one question. Mr. Russell, do you see that possibility?
There's certainly a possibility. And speaking as someone who attended the meetings that Joe Biden had as vice president with Xi Jinping beginning in 2011, I would very much favor such a meeting and look forward to it, because I think that the two leaders have a deep mutual understanding between them. They have got a strong relationship, and that we're at a moment, particularly in Chinese politics, I think, where it is not so easy for solutions to be reached at lower bureaucratic levels. There are a lot of issues that may have to be dealt with directly by the leaders, and these are two leaders who are both very experienced and very capable statesmen and diplomats, and are able, I think, to get past posturing and dig into the issues and to the substance in a constructive way. So I would look forward to such a meeting, but we should be clear that both the Chinese and the U.S. side appear to feel it is premature to try to lock in a high-level meeting. And they have moved very, very slowly in really laying the groundwork for the kind of substantive outcomes and decisions that one would like to see from such a leader meeting.
Also like to invite the answer coming from Mr. Yuan Peng from China. The U.S. side has been talking about, quote, from the White House press secretary, at some point, the face-to-face diplomacy. And she said, the president, the U.S. president, continues to believe in face-to-face diplomacy. Now, Mr. Yuan, what is China's current feeling of a possible top interaction directly?
I personally, I look forward to the coming meeting between the two leaders. The head of state summit always played very important role for the relations, and in today's very difficult period of the relations, the head of state meeting I think played more vital role. So I do hope that the recent meetings by the two top diplomats can play some condition for the future head of state meeting. I think, first of all, the two heads of the states, they knew each other and they're friends. And secondly, they have a very good phone call during the New Year's Eve this year, and it lasted almost more than 100 minutes. And Joe Biden always boasted that the longest phone call with foreign leaders, and they knew each other. I think today the head of states meeting will set the direction and the tone for the relations. Yet because the relations is hardly to be driven by those lower levels of the diplomats.
Now, both of you are very seasoned diplomats and also the leaders in diplomacy thinking. Let me ask you, over the past decades of interaction between China and the United States, well, of course, one could argue it now, it's a very different case, but still, how much work does it take before a heads of state meeting taking place? Usually, what are these levels of issues that needs to be handled beforehand? And usually what people would expect out of a heads of state meeting if it happened. Mr. Russell, you served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific. You know very well about that part. Tell me more about what's your experience.
Well, typically a U.S.-China summit represents the culmination of a all-of-government process on both sides to work through the issues and try to identify what can be accomplished, what the big deliverables would be, how to handle the areas of disagreement, what are the real problem areas, what are we going to say publicly that the two sides agree on, how are we going to talk about issues where there is clearly a sharp difference of opinion, and are there symbolic gestures and steps? Maybe it's a banquet, maybe it's a visit to somewhere by the two leaders, something that creates a symbol, a visual cue for the world that shows something about the relationship, the message they're trying to convey. However, I think we're in quite a different circumstance today, an unprecedented chapter in the U.S.-China relationship. And I'm not at all sure that any of the traditional processes for preparing for a leaders' meeting are in place. On the other hand, as Yunpeng pointed out, these are two leaders who have a pre-existing and very constructive personal relationship, and that can make a difference as well.
Professor Yunpeng, your take.
Yeah, I agree, Daniel Russell. I think the head of today's meeting is a very expected, very important. For example, during Obama administration, almost each year, the two leaders met from the Sunny Land to Forbidden City to Hangzhou West Lake, including the White House. And those four meetings yearly played a very important role to stabilize the relations during the Obama administration, even if the relations during that time also faced some difficulties. And the Mar-a-Lago meetings between President Xi and President Donald Trump also played important role for the stabilization of the relations in 2017. And unfortunately, from that year on, up to now, no more head of states meeting. So in this very difficult period, we do hope the head of states meeting can play the important role to redirect the relations in the positive and stable direction.
Right. Well, there are a lot of differences, which I do not have to emphasize once again in our discussion between China and the United States. You see the daily press releases and the press conferences, they beautifully illustrated those differences. Now, what I want to concentrate on with our limited time of today's discussion is what tools do we still have in hand in terms of possibly bringing the relationship to a more reasonable discussion between the two sides. Mr. Russell, there was the first round of trade talks between China and the United States, and now we also see the latest report suggesting, international media reports suggesting Chinese ambassador to the United States might be on his way to Washington. Of course, that's according to international media report. The Chinese side has not confirmed that. So tell me more about what tools, what kind of channels do we have in hand from a seasoned diplomat like you between China and the United States from now on, Mr. Russell?
Well, typically, important channels include the diplomats on both sides, and I also heard that Qin Gang will arrive to take up his post in Washington soon. He reportedly has a close relationship with the Chinese leader, and frankly, that's the most important quality that an ambassador can have. That matters a lot. And there are other diplomatic connections that matter. Historically, the relationship between our business communities has been a very powerful and important stabilizing factor in the relationship. But over the past few years, we've seen the U.S. business community become very frustrated, disaffected, and much more critical, frankly, of China, much more focused on the difficulties in operating in China than in the past, and that has undermined a key source of support and also of good communication. We're not seeing the exchange between our politicians that we saw in the past.
Yeah.
It's more difficult for students, for researchers, and so on. So I think there's been a constriction of channels and an erosion of support in both countries for the relationship that we should worry about.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulties we all understand, and the list goes on, right, Mr. Russell? But what about the U.S. ambassador to China? We already heard Mr. Burns already being named. What about the next process? How much do we see time is needed for him to be in Beijing?
Unfortunately, the U.S. system for nominating and confirming ambassadors is extremely slow. And as a career diplomat, that's something that troubles me greatly. There's an urgent need for the president's representative to get to Beijing and to take up business. But look, there's a limit to what diplomats can do. I think there's also, Tianwei, a very important, broader sort of political issue in terms of widespread attitudes towards the other country, both in the U.S. and in China. And something I encounter a lot in discussions with Chinese friends is the feeling that China hasn't caused these problems. China couldn't solve these problems itself anyway. The responsibility for the deterioration of the relationship is all on the U.S. side, and the responsibility for fixing it is all on the U.S. side as well. And I think that's a very dangerous and unhealthy mindset, because what China does, not only through its diplomats, not only in economic terms and so on, but China's actions have a huge impact on policy in Washington, D.C. and in other capitals and so on.
Mr. Yuan Peng, of course, the Chinese side suggests that the U.S. should not use China as an imagined enemy to rally the domestic forces and to overcome its current difficulties, which its politics will not be able to handle. Mr. Yuan, what do you see as the tools that China and the U.S. could have in terms of real discussions? Let the reasoning mind be able to still work?
As two major powers, I think we need communications and dialogues and the channels. Maybe during Obama administration, we have 100 more dialogues. At least it need to be two more from Americans' perspective. But today, zero channel also is too little. So we need maybe dozens of dialogues. This is a more normal tracks, including the head of states meeting, including strategic dialogues, trade dialogues, and no more direct channels like to ambassadors. So on the one hand, we are sending our ambassador to the United States, but Americans still hesitating to send their ambassador to China. This also shows some negative attitudes from American side towards China. So we hope today, if Joe Biden's administration is sincere enough, that they need to do something. We blame on Americans to do the wrongdoings for everything, but not blame on Joe Biden to do everything bad. We just blame on his predecessors. So as the new administration, we do hope Joe Biden can show some more positive attitudes comparison with his predecessors.
Already 6 months passed. Of course, both sides have already developed certain kinds of shall we say, framework toward the other side, even though a lot of things are still in the process. I would assume will be a long time to come before both sides really set clear what the policies might be like. Further questions about how the two sides are setting the stage and the groundwork. We see both sides are quite active in the Asia-Pacific region recently, not only with one another directly, but also with others. For example, the U.S. Secretary of Defense traveling to Singapore, Vietnam, and some of the other countries. Meanwhile, we also see the Secretary of State from U.S. traveling to India. China also has been quite active in diplomacy with the ASEAN countries celebrating 30 years of exchange. And also China recently, the Chinese State Councilor Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with the leader of the Taliban and has been talking about China's role in Afghanistan. So, Professor Yuan, tell me more about how do you see both sides are trying to set the stage and the groundwork for a better bargaining power when it comes to bilateral relations?
First of all, the relations of the U.S. and China is not the only bilateral. I think Chinese has our relations for many other countries, so is the American side. But if we compare some Americans' recent, actions, including Blinken's and Secretary of Defense visits to Singapore and India, to see it's very China-related. And the Chinese State Councilor recent meeting, take another example with the Afghanistan Taliban. I think it's a totally different relations in nature. Our relations with the Taliban is for helping Afghanistan for stabilizing its internal affairs after American prematurely irresponsibility leaving Taliban, leaving Afghanistan. So without Chinese, play its proper role, how can we imagine a stable, Afghanistan? So this is helping American to help to stabilize the religion after American decide to leave Taliban very prematurely. So this is not against American; it's helping American. But on the contrary, we see Americans Quad its relations with India, Australia. It's very much China imaginary rational enemy driven actions. This is different.
I see. Mr. Russell, same question in a different way, though. We saw that the U.S. is trying to rally its allies to build some kinds of front line against China. Of course, the U.S. and others well understood that the biggest difficulty is whether there's really unity there. And that has been demonstrated several times over the past few months of the problems. And the other thing is, how do you see, Mr. Secretary of Defense talking about constructive relationship with China, stable and constructive relationship with China? How do you see this mixture of attitude, Mr. Russell?
Thanks, Chen-Wei. Look, it is a good thing for China and for the United States to engage actively with Asian countries on a whole range of issues. And, Tony Blinken recently held a virtual summit with the 10 leaders of ASEAN. As you mentioned, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is in Southeast Asia right now. And I think to hear from the Secretary of Defense a message emphasizing the importance of constructive relations between the U.S. and China is indicative of the fact that soldiers who understand the risks of armed conflict and are well aware of the tremendous destructive power of both militaries have an institutional interest in being careful and avoiding miscalculation, avoiding escalation. That's a very important part of American strategy in the region. And one of the reasons that we think it is important for there to be authentic dialogue between the U.S. Department of Defense and the People's Liberation Army. And it's unfortunate that we haven't been able to engineer that kind of communication that we need. Now, President Biden has hosted summit meetings of Asian leaders in Washington. He's championed through the Quad a vaccine initiative in Southeast Asia. I think it is a big mistake to believe that the United States is the one who is raising the topic of China with all Asian partners or directing the Quad to be some sort of anti-China enterprise. That may have been an element of the Trump administration's approach, but I don't believe that it is of Biden's. And in fact, countries in Asia don't need the United States to raise the issue of China. They want to talk about China because they are frankly concerned about some of Chinese behaviors.
Okay.
Now, my experience, Tianwei, is that the countries in the region want to have it both ways. They don't want to have to choose between China or the United States, but they don't want to be bullied and they don't want to be abandoned either.
Okay, Mr. Yuan Peng, I have to let you respond to that because there are some accusations coming out of Mr. Russell toward China. So it's only fair I let you respond before we wrap it up. Mr. Yuan.
Yes, I hope that the last few words mentioned by Russell is correct. But it's very hard for many Chinese to believe that Americans just don't put China as an enemy from these concrete actions.
Okay.
So I hope Russell can play some kind of role. Okay.
All right. Thank you, both of you. We are already running out of time for the first round of discussion. Daniel Russell, Yuan Peng, really appreciate it for both of you, under the current circumstances, be able to put some of the rhetorics aside and talk on concrete. Really appreciate it. Thank you.